Part of this. This is the final meeting. Wow, seems bad to me. I don't want to say goodbye. Jennifer, I'm used to seeing you on my left and, making sure that you and I are always looking at each other. So now I got to look up on the screen for you. So yeah, this is it. So what we're going to do is pick up on where we left off the last time. I think we have 6 recommendations left to get through. I know that we can get through them rather quickly, I hope. Hopefully you've had an opportunity to look over those recommendations one more time, and we can get to a consensus on those recommendations. After that, after we're done with that part of it, we're going to take one vote to basically vote on the report that will be final. So I think that's it for me in terms of introduction. Did I miss anything?
Yeah, I'll just do some logistical notes before we do roll call. As a reminder, the way we run this final meeting is that after we approve the final recommendations, we do vote on the annual report. The annual report, of course, chiefly is composed of the recommendations themselves. So what we provided in advance is sort of the shell of the report that goes around the recommendations. So what we'll be asking for is a vote to approve the annual report with all of the cleanup work that staff has to do. Move the recommendations into the report, format it, make it look nice. And then the department will prepare the report for its formal submission. It's now due December 15th of every year. It used to be November 15th, but there was legislation this session that moved a number of reporting deadlines back to December 15th. So the department will clean it up based on the direction from the commission and sort of take care of the rest after. Since this is a recommendations voting session and the report voting session, we will have public comment at the top as per usual. So members of the public who wish to provide a comment who are online, please put your name in the chat. And if there are any in the room here, raise your hands. Members of the public may not have any today in the room. So we'll turn to public comment after the roll call. So
can I just say one more thing? I have to say this. I just want to, because this is our last meeting. I have been so impressed with this commission, with everyone, your passion. Everyone spoke up. Seems like everyone is on board with what we're trying to do in terms of climate change. Just the support that I felt with this commission. I didn't know what to expect being the new chair or walking in. But wow, we have the best people across Maryland being a part of this. And I'm just thrilled that we could all come together and make this happen. So thank you for your participation and just being who you are.
thank you.
Kim, you have any words you'd like to say?
I think you said it beautifully, so thank you, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Excellent. So why don't we do a roll call going around the room? Starting with the chair.
Yes, I'm the chair. Serena McElwain, secretary. I'm here.
Kim Coble, LCV.
Hi, folks. David Smedic, environmental NPO representative on the commission.
Josh Kurtz, DNR secretary.
Darren Lobos, Chief of Environment and Sustainable Transportation at MDOT, and I'm here for Secretary Paul Williams.
Robin Gilden, University of Maryland School of Nursing.
I'm Beth Harbor. I'm a philanthropic representative with the Able Foundation.
David Lapp, Maryland People's Council.
Paul Pinsky, MEA.
Excellent. And I will call names I see on the online meeting for roll. Commissioners I see our co-chair Ann Lindner. I see our co-chair Charmaine Brown. I see Delegate Stein. I see Eric Fisher. I see Jennifer Laszlo Mizrahi. I see Administrator Belton. I see Mike Powell. Dr. Dickerson. I see Chair Feldman. I Are there commissioners I missed when I was reading through the online attendance?
Chris, this is Jason Duba. I'm attending as proxy for Secretary of Flora, MDP.
Thanks, Jason. Yeah, Dave?
Hi, this is Dave Namazi. I'm attending as proxy for Dr. Bill Dennison.
Thank you, Dave.
Did you hear me? I'm attending for Dr. Bill Dennison.
Great. Thank you, Dave. We hear you. And Thomas?
Yeah, good morning. Thomas LaQuire, Maryland Department of General Services. I'm sitting in for Secretary Chaudhry.
Okay. Thank you all. We have a quorum, so we can proceed. So we can turn now to public comments before we get into the commission's formal business. We have one public commenter in the chat. If there are others, please put your name in the chat while we start. With the one, and I'm just double checking that here. Okay. Ann Wilson.
Thank you. Yeah, my name is Ann Wilson. I live in the city of Baltimore, and I'm active as a volunteer with a bunch of environmental justice organizations in the city. And thank you for the opportunity to comment before the commission. And thank you for the excellent set of recommendations. I would like to comment on, I think it's number 22, about aligning the state budget with the state's climate goals. And I think that's a fantastic recommendation, of course, and just want to underline that since the overall goal is not just the elimination of fossil fuels, but the reduction and eventual elimination of greenhouse gas emissions, that many of us feel very strongly that not only should we be targeting fossil fuels and the emissions from those, but also the emissions and public health impacts and environmental harm and ecological harm from some other energy sources like trash incineration, biogas, and biomass, and that the combined impacts of those energy sources ought to ensure that they're included in underneath that recommendation. So at the top, it sort of highlights not investing in fossil fuel infrastructure. And then further down, it does mention ensuring that that the state only invests in zero emission technology. And I would hope that that does include acknowledging the problems with methane leaks and other issues with some of these technologies that are still under the state policies considered to be renewable energy. And again, trash incineration, biogas in all its forms, and biomass. Thanks for your time.
Thank you so much. So we'll move next. If there are no other public comments, then we will move next to approval of the minutes. Draft minutes from our meeting last week have been provided, and we're working on screen share here if you bear with us, but those online, you should be able to pull them up from the electronic materials today, and those in the room, you should have a copy here. So are there any edits or discussion of the draft minute? Okay, is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So move.
Second.
Thank you.
Okay, for the minutes, perhaps we'll just do a quick voice vote. I'm all in favor.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the minutes are approved. Thank you all. And so we can now pick up where we left off on the recommendations. I'll bring them up on the screen here. Okay. Oh, sorry about that. Let me just do a Google Docs shoot. Okay, good.
Yeah, we gotta make sure everything, these documents is bigger.
Okay, we'll work on that. Apologies.
Okay.
Okay, so last week, we left off just before addressing mitigation working group recommendation number 19, modifying STRIDE to reduce ratepayer costs and facilitate electrification. Tim or Mike, would you like to introduce this as MWG co-chairs?
Yes, thank you, Chris. I'll start out and then we'll turn it over to my co-chair, Mike Howell, who is enjoying Portugal, but taking time off from his vacation to be here.
Wow.
So,
Thank you, Mike.
great decision.
Happy to oblige.
Wow.
Yeah, thank you. So number 19 is to modify the STRIDE program. And I'm not going to read it word for word, but just to point out that what's being recommended is that the PSC General Assembly make modifications to the program that would end up prioritizing ratepayer supported investments on the highest risk assets. There are 5 specific things that are part of this recommendation. One is to direct gas companies to develop a risk assessment analysis. 2, to require justification as to why replacement is necessary. 3, require heightened analysis for service locations. 4, establish a notice requirements for customers' specific STRIDE work. And 3, the PSC should require utilities to submit specific analyses on climate and rate impact. This recommendation was presented here at the Climate Commission meeting 2 or 3 meetings ago. And then the mitigation work group spent a fair amount of time with presentations as well. We've had follow-up correspondence from the gas companies on this. It passed the mitigation work group with 14 in favor and 6 opposed.
Thank you, Kim.
I don't think there's anything to add there. I mean, the commission has heard a great deal about this in the past. I'll just mention that all but one of the mitigation working group recommendations you're going to consider today did have opposition and were not unanimous. But obviously the commission should make their own decisions on all of these issues.
Okay, discussion from the group. I see a hand up from Ann Lindner.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, and thanks to the co-chairs of Mitigation Working Group for introducing this. You know, I think there was quite a bit of discussion that happened in the mitigation work group, and I guess I just wanted to highlight a couple of points that were made there for the benefit of the rest of the commission. The first is that STRIDE encourages the acceleration of pipeline replacement, and by doing so, it's achieving material greenhouse gas emissions through leak reduction and prevention. So I don't want to miss that point, that the work that's going on there is actually helping us to meet our GHG reduction goals. The second point I want to make is that some of the discussion around stopping STRIDE altogether is an extreme outlier among states with a significant amount of cast iron and bare steel pipe in the ground. So if you look at a state such as New York, even though they have extremely ambitious climate goals, they are still committed to the gas system replacements. And then I think the final point that I would like to make is that, you know, from both a safety and a GHG reduction perspective, STRIDE is doing important work. And we think that the Public Service Commission is the appropriate venue to sort of make the policy decisions around STRIDE. And with that, I'll cede my time. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. Discussion, yes, David Lapp.
I guess the main point is that virtually everything that you just heard is very consistent with these proposals here. They require consideration of the state's greenhouse gas emissions. They require consideration of safety, and none of those considerations are in the current law. You know, looking at alternatives and looking at the different options is is consistent with all of that. And that's all this bill really, or all this recommendation requires. I also want to just, and it would continue, the gas utilities would still have the ability to continue this stride work. This doesn't end it. I mean, that's the core. I mean, we think that there should be a much stronger recommendation here than what is here, because the gas utilities will be able to continue the stride work as you just heard is going on in New York, but they are looking at alternatives in New York. And Maryland does not do that. We just had a decision from an administrative law judge, a PULJ, at the commission just a week ago say that the stride statute we were suggesting that alternatives should be evaluated, and the judge said that alternative evaluation is not supported by the text of the stride statute. We don't agree with that interpretation, but we're just trying to say, let's make that happen here. And I just, one final point, and that is that this is the place to make recommendations to the legislature. We are engaged in these discussions at the Public Service Commission. The commission has noticed a comments on our gas planning petition, and that is all that is going on. So right now, there is nothing more than what's already happened at the commission until they decide, if they do, to do something further. And the gas utilities before the Public Service Commission are saying, wait for the General Assembly. So the idea that we need to wait for the PSC is inconsistent with what they are actually telling the PSC. And I can read to you, I have right here, BGE's comments to the Public Service Commission say that that the PSC should await further directives from state lawmakers, which will provide for a much more efficient proceeding, etc. So what's going on here is that at the Public Service Commission, the gas utilities are pointing to the General Assembly, and here they're saying, wait for the Public Service Commission. We need to move forward. We cannot, in the meantime, billions of dollars are being invested, that are locked in for long periods of time.
Thank you. We have a hand up from Dr. Dickerson, then we'll hear from David Smetic.
Just a very quick technical point that the natural gas infrastructure in Baltimore leaks at a rate of something like 1 or 2% of usage, but it is improving over the past 5 years. The total emissions, we can't prove that it's a natural gas system, but total emissions of methane from Baltimore and Washington have been going down over the past few years. So do with that technical information what you wish.
Thanks, Dr. Dickerson. David Smetic?
Yeah, I'll be relatively brief. I think I've got a lot of thoughts on the issue at hand, but for this recommendation in particular, I do see this as a positive recommendation from this commission, for starters. I support this. I think it's smart for us to go forward with, because it's really, it's frankly a little less ambitious than what this commission has recommended in the past. We've recommended much more proactive action from the General Assembly, the Public Service Commission, and other entities on the issue of continuing investments into the gas distribution system. So for me, continuing having this recommendation specifically on the STRIDE program, asking the Public Service Commission and particularly the General Assembly to require additional analysis, additional risk assessments, it's pretty easy request, I think, for this commission to make so that we can get more information about it. I still think that we should be and can be recommending actions that we have in the past that are a little bit more ambitious in terms of addressing the investment going into the infrastructure here and planning more proactively forward with it. But this kind of information that we would get as a result of those risk assessments and analyses will help us with that future planning. So I think it's a pretty smart step forward for us to be recommending to those decision makers. This is a good step forward.
David.
Yeah, I want to second what David Smetic just said, and say that, we're a body that gets to recommend to the legislature and then to the extent that the PNC is watching as well. And what this recommendation does is help generate discussion and public discussion. So we're a body here, you know, the public gets to provide input, but at the legislature, the public gets, you know, additional opportunities for input. And so I would fully support this recommendation.
You bet. Any other thoughts from commissioners? Just we'd entertain a motion on this recommendation.
Yes.
Is there a motion on this recommendation?
Move to adopt.
Second. We have a second. Okay, so we'll be voting now on whether to include this recommendation as drafted in the draft annual report. This is mitigation working group recommendation number 19. Jennifer, is that a vote or a hand up to discuss the motion?
It's a vote in favor.
Okay, so we'll go first with all in favor. Online, please click the hand raise, and in the room, please physically raise your hand. Okay, in the room, you can lower your hands. Online, please keep them up. Thank you. You can lower your hands online. Any opposed? Okay, thank you. You can lower your hands. Any abstentions? Okay, thank you. You can all please lower your hands. So this recommendation is approved for inclusion in the annual report. We had 17 in favor, 2 opposed, and 1 abstention. And Dr. Dickerson, if you wouldn't mind lowering your hand.
Right. Very good.
Thank you all. Moving next to mitigation working group number 20 on aligning state spending with climate goals. Tim, Mike?
Yeah, thank you. The next 4 remaining 4 recommendations pertain to how the state is spending money. And the overarching umbrella here is the recommendations from the mitigation work group is that those expenses align with the climate goals the state have set. So each of these deal with a different framework of that, but that's the ultimate goal for each of them. So number 20 is asking the governor and the General Assembly to ensure that state spending on energy projects promotes climate-aligned zero-emission technologies and does not incentivize fossil fuel projects, with a minimum of delivering at least 40%. And I believe that should be of funding. That might be an amendment we need to overburden underserved communities. So that includes the grants, the incentives, financing from the federal government as well. This received approval from the mitigation work group, 11 in favor and 7 opposed. Mike?
Yeah, just point out, as you mentioned, that this also, unlike some of the recommendations we considered in the past, includes grants, incentives, and financing from the federal government, which sometimes, of course, come with their own restrictions on them.
I think you can, Mike, discussion from the commissioners. David Semitic. Oh, yeah.
I just use my ignorance, but isn't this already part of the Justice 40 initiative, or is this something different?
It would align with the Justice 40. I think what this is saying is that the Maryland Commission on Climate Change really supports that approach for those funds.
Okay.
David?
Yeah, just the point Kim made about small amendments to be included here. Kim and I chatted about it. And I think to align it better with some Maryland statute, I think in the Climate Solutions Now Act, having the words at least 40% of funding, not benefits, to overburden and underserved communities is the language that my understanding is in the Maryland statute. Yeah. So it's Justice 40 initiative, just like a couple different words. But to better align it with the Climate Solutions Now Act language, I think that was the intention of that language change. Potential language change, I should say.
I see. Okay.
And then instead of environmental justice and low-income communities, Chris, it would be to overburdened and underserved, which is the codified language
Okay.
in Maryland.
Okay. So we have some amendments on the screen here to align with language from Climate Solutions Now Act. Co-chairs, I guess I defer to you all on whether you would consider that a friendly amendment or whether we should entertain motions on it.
I mean, to me, it's not a substantive amendment. It might be worthwhile making sure that the commission supports it, because obviously it's difficult for us to speak for the whole mitigation working group in a situation where we had 7 opposed already, even to the original language.
Maybe take a vote on it.
Sure.
Yeah.
And why don't we, so we can, yep, we can have a motion to amend it if there's no more discussion on the topic as a whole. Is there a motion to amend the recommendation? Okay, so moved. We have a second.
Second.
Okay, great. So we're voting on the amendments on the screen here to align the language with the Climate Solutions Now Act. All in favor, please raise your hands. Thank you. In the room, you can lower your hands. Online, please keep them up. Okay, thank you. You can lower your hands online. Any opposed to this amendment? Are the 2 hands still up leftovers? Or are those new no's?
Yeah, I mean, that's right.
Charmaine and Dave?
I'm sorry, that was the yes. I'm sorry.
That's a leftover yes hand, correct? Yes. And then Charmaine, is that a leftover yes hand? We cannot hear you, Charmaine.
It carries anyway.
I
can always
believe
ask to
that
clarify
Charmaine
later.
had to step away.
I see. Okay, yeah, so that's a leftover one. Any abstentions? Okay. Okay, thank you. All right, so the amendment does carry. So if everyone could lower their hands with 17 yes, 1 abstention. Is there any other discussion on the recommendation itself before we entertain motions to vote on it?
Okay.
Okay, is there a motion on recommendation 20 from the mitigation working group? We
Motion
have
to approve.
Actually, I'm sorry, I do have a question. Because it changed from the word benefits to the word funding, that's where my question is. So I just didn't understand, because we've talked about very large tax incentives for buying EVs, for example, that that wouldn't necessarily, it's just, I didn't know if there was a financial analysis of funding versus benefits.
I think the intent was to align the language of Justice 40 and this, so that, and the Justice 40 language from the Biden administration is that 40% of funding would go to overburdened, underserved communities. So it was just to be consistent about the application of that initiative. Does that make sense?
So I'm asking the question because as a philanthropist, I've seen that in many of the nonprofit scenarios that sometimes there are not bids from communities that are able to meet some of the needs of the project, and they're still working to create collaboration so that it can be the funding going to those groups, but sometimes it's the benefit in partnership and not necessarily the funding. So that's why I was asking. I do support the principle overall very much.
Okay. Any other discussion?
Any other discussion on that point? No? Okay. Well, thank you. I think we'll move then to vote on the motion that we have to approve this as amended for inclusion in the draft annual report. All in favor, this is mitigation working group number 20. Please raise your hands. And lower them in the room. Thank you. Online, please keep them up.
First two here contradicts us. I think you.
Okay, you can lower them online. Thank you.
Solutions for the fee-free.
Please lower your yes votes online. Are there any opposed? Okay, and any abstentions? Okay, this one passes 19 yes, 1 abstention. Thank you. Moving to the next item.
Okay.
Mitigation work group number 21, ending CEF support for fossil fuel projects. Yes, Kim.
All right, so the Strategic Energy Investment Fund that MEA oversees, the most, probably the germane part of this recommendation is midway down where the language is in there, and it specifically would prohibit CEF funds to be used to install new equipment that uses fossil fuels or improves the efficiency of existing equipment that uses fossil fuels. So again, the state funds are, anybody can purchase a fossil fuel appliance or equipment. It's just that state dollars will not be used to subsidize this, is what is being recommended here. This has been a recommendation for the last 3 years from the mitigation work group, and was approved by the group, 14 in favor and 5 opposed.
You may want to ask MEA, I assume Director Pinsky, to explain the amendment just briefly.
Yes, we had an amendment proposed by MEA before the meeting.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you, chairs. As soon as the government new administration came in, we at MEA put up our own internal policy in place to not invest in grants and fossil fuels or that extended the infrastructure or projects. So we are fully on board with moving away from continuing state investment in fossil fuels, particularly from the CEF fund. However, it's been brought to our attention that, for want of a better word, a gas-fired furnace might need a tune-up. I'm going to use that like as with a car, a tune-up, where it doesn't prolong the life, it doesn't invest in the infrastructure, but it is more efficient. So while we think significant investments in projects, expanding fossil fuel, growing fossil fuel infrastructure should be off the table, we think there are a few unique circumstances where we don't want to fully shut the door. So our purpose in this amendment on under 21 is for that reason. So, we don't want to cut off our nose to spite our face. In other words, if something can be more efficient and use less gas, we shouldn't say no. But we support 100% the paradigm shift to move away from supporting, underwriting, expanding fossil fuels. So without equivocation on that, we just think there are a few circumstances we don't want to be totally shut out on. So that's the genesis of this.
Thank you. Discussion from the group. David Lapp.
Yeah, I think we're generally okay with the concept. I'm just wondering how it gets implemented. I mean, how do you determine, is this, is there like a process that MEA would have to say, okay, it's okay here, or And, maybe you haven't thought that, I don't know. Have you thought that through or is there
We
any?
haven't worked it out. Look, our default is that we're not investing in fossil fuels. We have, I think, at least one category of like 20 grant rebate programs. And at least in one, it would allow for minor tune-up things like that. So I think we would do it on a case-by-case basis. I mean, look, if the commission wants to recommend more narrow rails for this, we're not against it. We haven't played it out yet. I mean, this is a recommendation to the legislature, so it doesn't close the door. We just haven't figured out the application.
Should we, and I understand your point, and thank you for that. I'm wondering if, so not to keep the door open, and it sounds like MEA will have, discretion to decide which ones fit and which one do not fit, and maybe just prevent any future issues with that. Could we perhaps amend it again to say with the understanding that some kind of criterion will be established to base these limited cases against? Is that where you were going?
Yeah, I mean, that's what I'm trying to understand. I mean, and one way maybe that would accomplish that if it said very limited and specific. If without getting in, so it's more, a little more targeted.
We have that would be seen as friendly amendment. We have no objection to that.
Okay, I made that change on the screen.
But specific cases still has to be defined.
Yeah, I mean, I think it really still leaves discretion with MEA.
Basically, the applicant has to justify why it's appropriate. So the default is that it's not allowed. The applicant has to come in and provide those justifications, and then we would evaluate it like we evaluate all our grants. That's sort of how it's working.
Okay.
And there is an additional category that the director didn't mention, which is there are certain applications, right, where there's just no way right now to electrify, high intensity heat, industrial processes, where there are still ways to reduce emissions that may be fossil fuel at this point, right? The cement industry, things like that. We don't want to close the door there, where there's just no technical way right now to electrify without actually increasing emissions.
See.
Oh, I just want to add, in my work, we fund a number of groups that do energy efficiency work in low-income households. And, when contractors go in and they do the monitoring, they can find high CO levels in the house that are dangerous. So I would support this amendment because the recognition that we don't have enough money to electrify every low-income house at the moment, but we do find very dangerous situations that affect health and safety, and so this would be a practical way to address that.
David.
Yeah, I appreciate Beth's point. I think the health and safety pieces are important there, and those minor tweaks and repairs to those kinds of equipment can be really important for health and safety purposes. So it's a really good flag. I think generally, I like this as well. I like Commissioner Lapp's point about specific, just a little inclusion there. One other thing two other things I'll highlight in here just briefly. I think the amendment does take away a recommendation to the General Assembly. I think the General Assembly can still review the report, think themselves important to weigh in here. It's the recommendation at that point then is administratively focused and having the governor to more formally, I suppose, direct the MEA to do this. And then at the very end, having MEA, I actually really like this last piece of having MEA, which may already happen a little bit, but having it more codified of MEA working with stakeholders that receive direct bill assistance from the Strategic Energy Investment Fund to make sure that they are receiving whole home retrofits that help them address the root causes of some of those direct bill assistance issues. So I think that it's, I'm glad it's still in there, but I did want to highlight that for the commission. I think it's an important part of the work under SEEF. But I think when I was thinking through this piece here, that the CEF pot, I think, has so many different pieces coming into it. It's the Reggie funds. There are alternative compliance payments that have additional restrictions around them. The Public Service Commission can direct funds to it as well. I think that's where the more encompassing language is important to have for this. And I think that's on the General Assembly to be putting that directive and those boundaries around it. So that's where I think we can still move forward with it as amended. But the General Assembly piece, I'd be curious if we should have the governor and the General Assembly referenced in there some point. I'm not sure I have the right language on it. So if folks aren't comfortable with that, that's okay. But I do think the General Assembly has a pretty significant role over the governance of CEF that we don't want to lose sight of.
Okay.
I don't know. I'm just kind of talking myself in a circle there, I suppose. But so I appreciate the amendment efforts here and the health and safety aspects that can move forward.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, David.
Any other comments before we move on to a vote? Okay,
Okay, then, do we have a motion on recommendation 21 as amended?
So moved.
Do we have a second?
Second.
Okay, so this is a motion to include recommendation 21 as amended for inclusion in the draft annual report. All in favor, please raise your hands. Lower them in the room. Online, please keep them up. You can lower them online. Any opposed? Are any abstentions? Thank you. This recommendation is approved for inclusion in the annual report. The vote was 17 in favor, 2 abstentions. Moving to the next recommendation, 21, from the mitigation working group, requiring state funds are not used for fossil fuel projects.
Thank you, because I believe it's 23.
23.
Let's see, this recommendation is consistent again with clear direction about state funds not going to fossil fuel projects, encouraging the governor to issue an executive order that directs state funds be reserved for investments in projects that are fossil fuel free, including state contracts, financing, and state-owned projects. This is the idea was to try to mimic what the presidential executive order stated about decarbonizing the federal, and now we're saying the state government. This is consistent with recommendations that the mitigation work group had done in years past, worded a bit differently, and was approved by the mitigation work group 11 with 9 opposed. So it was a close vote. Mike?
I think the only thing I would add, and correct me if my memory is wrong, there was some concern among mitigation work group of exactly what were the details of executive order 14057 from the federal, and so what that would mean. So I think there was, I think the reason it was closed is there was a feeling that we don't really understand how that, what the implications would be, or some people were not felt comfortable about what the implications would be.
Thank you, Kim and Mike. I see we have a hand up from Ann Lindner.
Yeah, I just had an implementation question on this one. So, like, what happens at BWI? They don't get funding?
I don't know the answer to that.
Okay. When I read it, it just read very broadly to me in terms of, you know, like we saw the exceptions on the CEF one, right, where it's not practicable or whatever the language was. So I just don't know how you would practically implement this, I guess, is where I'm coming from.
I think, and that was the concern of some of those who were opposed, and I'm stepping carefully here because I think I voted against this one. It's the recommendations in prior year, at least from memory, did not reference the presidential executive order. And so the concern that some expressed were how that executive order would be implemented on the state level. Prior recommendations had recommended that state funds be used for decarbonization. Much of the language here, but I don't think there was a specific reference to that executive order.
Thank you, Mike.
We have a hand up from Kim and then Jennifer and Darren.
I don't quite remember the meeting the same way Mike does, but regardless, the reference to the executive order is just that. It's a reference. It says this action would be similar. So it, and then the last sentence is the definition and many of the strategies within the executive order should guide the governor. So it's almost unnecessary language. What it's doing is to provide the framework from which the governor could then base his executive order off. So it's not directing as much as guiding.
Jennifer?
I'm wondering if, Anne, we could address your concern by changing the word reserved in the first line to strongly prioritized.
I mean, I think that helps. I'm not necessarily opposed to the concept, except for the fact that, right, I think there are some places where there is state funding for fossil fuel type activities, BWI being the most obvious one. So.
Darren and then David Smetic.
Yeah, I'm quickly reading the executive order. And strangely, actually, the executive order gives me some comfort based on the way it's worded in terms of timeframes and how reasonable it reads. Our concern about this is the BWI one, its effects on other modal administrations, and it's the question of low carbon materials in both capacity expansion and repair and maintenance projects. So this, depending on how this is implemented, it really complicated for everyone. Could undermine our mission.
So would that be the question of whether fossil fuel free applies to the cement in a project?
Cement, asphalt, steel, all of this, we're going to have to move to lower carbon materials use, that we haven't done that yet.
Sorry.
Thank you, Darren. We had David Smetic and then Chair Feldman.
Yeah, I think so. So this was one of the recommendations that, again, I brought forward to the full commission a number of meetings ago, when you were discussing funding prioritization for climate action work. And then again, it was kicked to the MWG for additional discussion, and we had it there. I think I'm even remembering back, like to Kim's point, they are references to the presidential executive order. And I do think that that's still a good guidepost for this. I think the intention here is what it boils down to is the Climate Commission recommending to Governor Moore that he issue an executive order for decarbonizing state government operations and actions, essentially. And so with a prioritization of fossil-free decarbonization work, as Darren noted, there's some how that trickles into embodied carbon and purchases and all that. I think that's another question, and the executive order provides guidance for that within the federal work. But I think that I think there's a pathway forward for this commission to be recommending to the governor to put forward a whole of government decarbonization plan and implementing instructions. And so the exact language we can quibble with in here over the next couple of minutes, but I think this captures it, and it kind of has references in there. So I think it's still pretty good, even if we need to tweak one or two words.
Okay. We have Chair Feldman and then Secretary McElwain.
Thank you. I guess two quick points. I don't know that Dana Stein, he may be off the call, so I guess I'm the only legislator here on the call at this point. But that said, I guess as the legislative representative here, at least on the Senate side, the idea of gubernatorial fiat through executive order, it's not just in this case where the General Assembly apparently has no role on a major policy call for the state of Maryland, but when you're talking about state contracts, those are Board of Public Works in some cases. We're talking about the state treasurer's office. We're talking about the comptroller has a role. So I guess this idea that a major policy decision here would be made, through an executive order without necessarily any input or relevance of treasurer, comptroller, the Maryland General Assembly, strikes me as sort of a use of executive order that, I think at times is problematic. I mean, it's clearly a subject of great debate at the presidential level, at the federal level, but we've even had it even last session in our legislature about, the use of executive orders. So it's more of a philosophical concern I have about that, sitting in the legislative branch of government.
Thank you, Chair Feldman. So Secretary McElwain had something too.
My general feedback kind of goes back to the amendment that you had, Director, which is, it doesn't sound like we're giving a little bit of flexibility when needed. And, there's not a one way fits all on here. So there should, I think it's the flexibility that's bothering me that's not in here. And I just think that should be a part of this recommendation, or for me, it would be hard for me to support this personally based on that.
Okay, I think we had a hand from David Smetic and then Mike Powell, but we could do the opposite. It looks like David's consulting. So maybe Mike and then David Smetic.
I think this sort of echoes some of the discussion within the mitigation work group. I think my feeling is there's consensus that there should be some prioritization of spending funds for the appropriate decarbonizing of government, pollution-free electricity procurement. But there's concern on one hand in referencing a presidential executive order, and on the second being an executive order as opposed to encouragement that the General Assembly take the criteria into account. The recommendations from prior years were less problematic and may go further along the way that we want to go. We could, if it's the preference of the commission, come up with language that simply encourages the governor and the General Assembly to prioritize decarbonizing of state government, such as carbon, pollution-free electricity procurement, et cetera. Use that language without referencing an executive order or indeed referencing the particular executive order.
Okay, David Smetic.
I'm hesitant to do this because I do like this, and I think that we're circling a path forward, but I also hear concern, and I think it could be worthwhile for us to table this for next year and have the mitigation working group discuss it a little bit more. And frankly, it doesn't preclude, I think that the Moore administration is pretty clear in its aim for doing this kind of work. It doesn't preclude the annual report to reference the role the administration can play in decarbonizing its operations. So I'm sensing hesitancy from the group, and something that I put forward in one of our previous discussions. So I'm willing to entertain a tabling of this into next year if folks are more comfortable with that. But
yeah. I'm very sympathetic, David, to your comment. Look, I think if we step back, the question is, the state of Maryland wants to make a paradigm shift to clean energy away from fossil fuel. But there are small things that might have to continue, as the secretary said. There is the concern of those who want to see the paradigm shift, that some people want to keep a fairly wide door open because there have been indications, and look, I think we've heard it from one sector saying that gas infrastructure should go on indefinitely into the future. So there's a nervousness of those who want to make the paradigm shift, but how wide is that door? And I think that, you know, I don't want to say it's how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. Trying to define those unique circumstances gets complicated. So, I mean, given that, I think if our message throughout this whole document is we are committed to a paradigm shift, we want the legislature and the administration to buy into and embrace that paradigm shift and spend little, if no, money on retaining and expanding fossil fuel. I mean, that's our message. If when we get down to the nuanced details, we don't want to be spending hours trying to define that in the abstract. So I have no qualms with that as long as that broader message is contained and shared.
Oh, and I just wanted to add, the thing I like about the federal EO is that Biden is saying we want to lead by example. We want the federal government to lead by example. And so we'd love to see the state say the same thing through executive order. I agree, though, we should table it. But I will just note that we should have a little humility too, as the commission, that lots of people are thinking about this at the same time. And I saw in the news this morning that the governor appointed a new chief sustainability officer and a chief resilience officer. And so I have confidence that this governor is going to move on this without action from us.
You are correct. That's really important to me too, as Secretary of Environment. This is really critical, but I just think that we need to take our time sometimes to make sure we got it right the first time and not just rush with everything. And this is one of those areas where even I, as bad as I want to do this, I just want to make sure that we're ready, you know, to do it, turn the switch off. And I don't feel comfortable. We're there right yet, but we're going to get there soon.
Motion to table. So we have a motion to table from author of this recommendation. Are there any seconds?
Second.
And we have a second, so we'll vote on whether to table this recommendation and let the mitigation working group continue to refine it for next year. All in favor? You can lower your hands in the room. Online, please keep them up. Okay, thank you. You can lower them online. Any opposed? And any abstentions? Okay, so this one is tabled for next year.
But it was a great recommendation.
Great recommendation.
Thank you.
It'll keep going.
Excuse me, Chris, what's the vote, please? I had 8
sorry.
online.
16 in favor. I counted 8 in the room, 7 online.
No, 8 online. You were looking down.
I flipped it. So that would be 16 in favor, you're saying?
I'm saying there were 8 in favor online.
Okay, all right, thank you. So this is tabled, 16.
Thank you.
None opposed or abstaining. Moving to mitigation working group number 24, where we have just a couple left here.
We have to move through well, how many more do we have?
This is the final one from the mitigation working group, and we have the climate justice steering committee. Then we had a request to amend mitigation working group number 7 2 meetings ago. With these 3 final ones.
How many minutes do we have left? I just want to make sure we get through them and be able to have that vote.
We have an hour
Hi,
left.
sorry, are we ready for climate justice? I got pulled away, my apology.
We're on the one right before there. We are all, yeah, thank you, Karen. We're always ready for climate justice, but we're on the
Almost.
I'm
mitigation.
sorry, are we ready for climate justice or no? I got pulled.
We have one more before we get there. It's next.
Okay, we can get started. We try to push through it though.
All right, great. Mitigation working group number 24. Kim?
It's with great pleasure that I present the last recommendation of the mitigation work group that passed unanimously. And that is to sunset, it's basically to work on the Empower program to make it more consistent with the goals of the state so that it's focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions with 4 provisions so that, yeah, and I'm not going to read these. It deals with greenhouse gas reduction targets. They encourage fuel switching from fossil fuels to electric appliances, ends incentives for fossil fuel appliances starting in 2024, and provides audits that recommend steps for buildings to become electric. So, Mike?
Yeah, just to add that this was a recommendation last year in the 2022 report. So we're repeating a recommendation that the commission previously adopted, and it was unanimous at the mitigation working group.
Thank you. Discussion, David Lapp.
This is more a process point, and I don't want to prolong anything here, but last year we put in the previous year's recommendations that had not advanced from 2021. And I feel like there's some ambiguity as to whether that was happening this year, because I had on slides when I presented to the full commission and to the MWG, I listed some of the prior year's recommendations, including this one, but there was also one for gas planning and for gas line extension policy that are still, we think are still necessary. And so I'm wondering if we were contemplating doing the same sort of thing this year in terms of moving in previous years. Gas utility planning was 2021 and 2022.
If I can interrupt you, David, we are going to have a discussion on the final report after we get these recommendations. And thank you.
Yep.
Thank you, David. Okay, any other discussion on this recommendation from the commission?
Okay.
Okay, hearing none. Is there a motion on this recommendation?
So moved.
Second.
Okay, so we have a motion to include this recommendation in the draft annual report. All in favor, please raise your hands. You can lower them in the room. And lower them online. Anyone opposed? Anyone abstain? Okay, so this recommendation is approved for inclusion in the annual report unanimously with 17 votes. So moving to the Climate Justice Steering Committee recommendation, Charmaine, would you like to introduce?
Thank you, Chris. I'm sorry, I apologize. I had gotten pulled away, but I appreciate the time to talk with you all about the Climate Justice Steering Committee's recommendation this morning. Before I do that, if you could just indulge me for a couple of minutes so that I can just quickly go back to the ECO recommendation around the campaign that we voted on. But one of the things that I really want for us to be mindful of is when we talk about campaigns and communicating, we're really talking about influencing and informing consumers so that they can make those important decisions that ultimately support our climate reduction goals. And particularly in some communities where information just does not flow easily or is not readily accessible. So I really wanted to just go back to that, recognizing that we had voted on it. The other thing that I want to do, because I'm not sure everyone is familiar with the Climate Justice Steering Committee, we've been together for about 2 years, and it's a committee comprised of climate leaders from the state mostly, and I have had the privilege of leading this team. Though I do not have a climate background, I have extensive experience in diversity, equity, and inclusion, and it's been my absolute privilege to be able to lead this group. I also want to just tell you what our mission is on the Climate Justice Steering Committee, because I think it's relevant. We are here to support, encourage, and ensure that the work that the MCCC does facilitates equitable outcomes for all Marylanders. And obviously, with the emphasis being on those underserved, overburdened, and I would add, historically marginalized. And this goes back to a conversation, Madam Secretary and Madam Chair, that we really had with you early in your career here with us around sometimes historically marginalized people no longer live in underserved or underrepresented communities. However, the impacts could still be disproportionate. So I'll leave it there. Thank you for indulging me. Now to this recommendation. And I am joined today by Dr. Eric Davidson, who is on the CJSC, and he represents us on the Science and Technical Working Group. And so I really leaned heavily on Dr. Davidson's knowledge in this area. And so it is with his experience and the CJSC's overarching mission that we are recommending that a new committee or task force be stood up that includes a wide variety of voices, perspectives, and lived experiences to look at the impact of woody biomass on communities and how woody biomass really either supports or doesn't our climate goals. There are reports, for example, that say that woody biomass is 150% more toxic than coal. I don't know if that's true. However, when you hear things like that, it certainly is worth taking a pause and really having deeper study around what the true impacts are. And then there are the other areas around, whether or not this is truly a renewable source, given when you take down a mature tree, how long it takes for another tree to mature and to be able to pull down the carbon. And so we just think that to have a multicultural group, including health experts, to look at this is just a good idea, and that this is worth more study. When you hear things like Allegheny County having the highest cancer rates in the state, families are an ecosystem. And when you think about cancer and how cancer can impact families and other types of diseases, asthma, all kinds of diseases that could come from an unhealthy climate, it's really worth pausing where coal plants are coming offline, not to repurpose them to bioplants. And so again, it is with that in mind that the group came up with this recommendation. We thank you for the opportunity to share it, and I'd be happy to take questions, and I would invite Dr. Davidson to please also join me as well in the conversation. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
We have a hand up from a commissioner, Jennifer.
I love this. I would like to add to the list of groups disability organizations.
Thank you, Jennifer. I would say that's a friendly recommendation.
Good question.
Yes, Secretary Kurtz.
I think the health impacts around biomass and around any of the fossil fuel burning plants are really critical for us to understand. And I think when we look at regions of this state, we've seen disproportionate impacts from those sources. I was wondering why we wouldn't look at other fossil fuel sources as well with this group, why it would just be biomass.
That's a great question. And so there's no reason why we couldn't. Why we chose to focus on biomass is because that's where the CJSC was getting a lot of, input and outreach from communities that are more concerned with biomass. But there's no reason why we can't consider some of the other forms. Dr. Davidson, do you have anything that you would add to that?
No, I think you've said it well. I think the point here is because there's a great deal of interest right now, both in trash combustion and expanding the woody pellet industry, that there's a lot of controversy around that, and therefore we think it merits having its own focus and resolution. I I think there's already been plenty of attention. There could always be more, but there's been a lot of attention on the impacts of combusting fossil fuels, and we know a lot about that. We know less about the impacts of burning wood and other forms of biomass that are present in trash. So that's why I guess the reason for separating this out to give it its own emphasis.
We have Kim Coble.
Charmaine, I love this recommendation, the intent of this recommendation. I think it's spot on and great. I'm concerned a little bit about the practicality, and I'm not even sure who to focus this question to. It might be Madam Chair, but this commission is, I think, stretched as thin as it can from a staffing perspective. So to create a whole nother task force and working group and a whole, I mean, that concerns me whether or not there's capacity here.
Yeah,
that's my concern.
Thank you.
I see Mike Powell.
Yeah, I'm sympathetic to the idea, and certainly we always have to be concerned to make sure we have balance and that all underrepresented groups are heard on each issue. But when we separate out something like woody biomass, a single issue, when there are lots of other very vocal groups who have other issues, incineration of solid waste, for example, or concerns about the transition to electric cars and what we're doing about infrastructure. My concern is that we're starting to elevate one issue because there has been particular interest by some group at particular points in time, and I'm concerned. It's similar to what Kim is expressing, but not quite the same. If we start building task forces on one specific group like woody biomass, then are we also going to do that for each of these other issues? At some point, all we can do is make the 40,000-foot recommendations and then expect groups like MEA, MDE, and the other administrative agencies to translate that into specific recommendations, and of course the General Assembly. So I feel like here we're getting, if you'll excuse the pun, a little too much into the weeds on a particular issue when we ought to be addressing broader horizons.
thank you, both of you. I'll let Dr. Davidson respond, and then I would also offer up some comments.
Well, the reason I think woody biomass needs particular attention at the moment is that we need to get ahead of the curve on this one, is that there's a tremendous amount of interest in expanding woody biomass use in the state and harvesting a larger fraction of our forests. And our forests constitute a major carbon sink at the moment. And and so to meet the goals that the state has, the very ambitious goals that the state has for 2040 and 2050, we depend upon that carbon sink. And so this is a little bit different from the health issue, but in terms of the carbon issue, this is something that we need to resolve uncertainties on this as best we can, get the issues out on the table and debate them as to whether using woody biomass would actually help or hinder the state in achieving its goals in the near term. And by near term, I mean 2040 or 2050, even sooner. And so this is an area of emerging concern that could become much, much bigger. And so that, I think, is the reason to get ahead of this now. And then the health impacts are also a significant part of that. And we've already heard numerous folks from the public referring to the trash incineration as being a very urgent issue for them as well. So it seems to me that for a couple of reasons, it does merit some particular attention in the short term. Whether it can be a new task force or not, I defer to all of you. The Science and Technology Working Group has also been struggling with this issue as well, and we're studying that as well.
Okay, I like to make some
Sure
comments
thing,
on
Ms.
moving
Secretary
forward
McElwain.
after, I think, Charmaine, and then I'd like to make a recommendation on what we need to do.
Okay, Madam Chair, actually, I don't really have anything more to add. I think Dr. Davidson just covered. The one thing I was going to say, Michael and Kim, both of your points are valid. One of the things that makes me most proud about being a Marylander and being on this commission is the fact that we listen. And I think that this recommendation and some of what we've seen in the others suggests that Maryland is listening to the people who we serve. So I will just leave it at that and turn it back over to you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Well, I think this is a really good recommendation. I really do appreciate, Charmaine, your passion and the fact that you brought this up as something that we need to consider. But I am hearing a lot of opinions about it, and I have my own, which is this is incredibly important. But for right now, I think what we need to do, in my opinion, is instead of asking the General Assembly to do this or to set up a task force, we could just have this action worked on by the MWG to do this in the 2024 work plan. I don't think we need to push this forward. This is something that we could do now. It's important. We can push it back to that important group, and then we can have a discussion about it at that time. That's what I'd like to see. Any comments about that before we move?
In that spirit, I'd also, I'd be happy to have some of our staff on the Forestry Service play a role in that too and help with that convening. So I think we can provide extra capacity there too. To Kim's point on capacity, I'd be happy for our kid to help with that.
Thank you.
Could we have STWG represented?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I would say the Science and Technology Work Group, since we're already working on that.
Absolutely. Kim?
And I would just add that we're now setting our agenda for the mitigation working group for next year. So it'd be very easy to add this and make sure all parties are heard.
It's important. I think we're going to make sure it's added because this can't be tabled. This has to continue this conversation. But Kim, you were going to say something?
Just following up on Secretary Kurtz, I believe it was 2 years ago, there was a work group within the mitigation working group on woody biomass. It was within that group. So we have the precedent of tackling this one and we'll pick it up again. Very good.
So I guess what I'll suggest then as facilitators that this could be a joint proceeding in the MWG and the STWG in 2024. The commission has, it used to include in the annual report many of recommendations for itself to take action. We've been moving away from that. So I'd suggest that this be sent to the working groups rather than included in the annual report so that we focus the commission's recommendations on action by other arms of the state.
I agree. Okay.
Okay, then I suggest process-wise, we could simply move on. This would not be included as a recommendation, but the co-chairs of the mitigation working group and the science technical working group, as well as several members, are prepared to pick it up in the 2024 work plans. Okay, so then the final recommendation is revisiting mitigation working group number 7. Which was discussed at the first recommendations meeting back in, I don't know, October, with a suggested amendment from MDOT.
Yeah. So I can talk to this. And this is mea culpa. This is something I should have realized was an issue for transit service and agencies after the Transportation Association of Maryland, which represented local transit got wind of this packet last time, a letter of strong opposition to it, mentioning they would have to slash services. And then our transit leadership within MDOT let me know in no uncertain terms that that's absolutely right. Based on their assessments, service would have to be by transit agencies. And services is key. And the concern is compatibility of this technology in the near term with the routes and the fleets that these systems operate, and the fact that they would have to trade off substantial service. And service is a matter of social equity. Advanced community populations rely on transit, but it's also the biggest contribution these agencies make to carbon reductions. Where transit is special, it can have really great tech, but that don't run frequently, reliably enough for people to ride them. Then sort of defeated the point in terms of the biggest contribution transit can make to fighting climate change. So service is paramount in terms of what transit agencies are able to provide. So that's why we offered an amendment clarifying that turnover to cleaner technology needs to happen expeditiously, that schedules, but and plans for that. And we want to make sure it's not created off for service. We'll see that's how they. Thank you.
Thank you, Darren. Discussion from the commission on the proposed amendment from MDOT. Yes, Kim.
So I get it. And I understand the point. However, this does not work for me. And I think for what the intent of the MWG original recommendation was, there's no, I mean, the state doesn't have to, no deadlines, no accountability, no inclusivity. I mean, this is, and apologize for the, let me see if I can find better words. This is not a consistent approach with the goals that I think this commission has. The approach, I'm, because it's 11:30, I'm in this debate about whether we just withdraw it or whether we try to find some that can tighten it up enough to be, to reflect the urgency that the state has in meeting these goals. So I don't know if anybody else has any thoughts, but I'm struggling on that one.
Yeah, others, or Darren, I see a hand up from Mike Powell.
I mean, this is a pretty massive change from what the mitigation working group considered. An alternative is to ask the mitigation working group to take it on the agenda this year and hear more from local transit oriented systems about what is doable or not doable, and to come back with a recommendation, making sure their opinions are considered without the commission having to consider a wholesale rewrite of the prior recommendation.
Darren, if you have a reaction.
I'm wondering, I heard, Kim, you mentioned the word tightening, and I realized as I worked with colleagues on this amendment, that it was a lot to add. So would striking any of this help to get at the intent, which is to move expeditiously to turning over this technology, however, to also not trade off service for that purpose? So for example, we could forgo the study. Yes.
Can you kind of remind us, just in terms of relative investment in transit, in what MTA operates versus locally operated? So there are sort of numbers of buses or something like that. Well, I mean, how much are we talking about that is locally operated versus what MTA operates?
I'm not sure. Of those numbers. I do know that the MTA has done an assessment of how much this would cost the locally operated transit systems. And their estimate is about $1 billion. Which means cutting service. That's what
And has it done that similar assessment for its own fleet?
Yes, but I don't have that with me. So it's something that MTA is obviously going to do as well, is transitioning their fleet to zero emission buses
Right.
as possible. It's proven to be a challenge there too. This is also a concern for MTA as well. We want to make sure we're not cutting service, right? Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, David.
I'm just sitting here with my hand up. Sorry, no, you guys are good. I wanted to chime in briefly because this is an issue that we provided a recommendation on in 2022. So similar to, I think, part of the conversation we'll have in a minute of how we're not carrying forward previous annual report recommendations, but specifically what we said in 2022 was the state should enact policies requiring the transition of all locally operated transit passenger buses to zero emission vehicles beginning as soon as possible with a full transition no later than 2040. So I feel like if we're hopefully, as I agree with Commissioner Lapp, carrying forward a number of recommendations that were not adopted previously, this would be a part of that package. I think that it could be worth us using this language again I do like the language that would be remaining here in terms of offering assistance to secure grants from other sources. Be a nice addition to what we said last year, but I think the language that we have from last year, I like a little bit better than the amended language. That's just another study and examining costs and everything again. I'll be honest, I don't love the 2040 deadline. I wish it could be a little sooner, but it does say as soon as possible. So I think that I'd offer that to the commission we did make a recommendation on this last year. And it could either carry forward with our inclusion of last year's recommendations again that were not enacted, or we could add a little bit from this year's into that.
Aren't you guys doing work in this area? Maybe.
Yes.
Right. So do we really need another study in addition to the work you're doing?
That's fine. I'm offering basically to strike that first sentence. So I'm offering to amend our own amendment if it helps. Because I understand the need.
Yeah.
And what David just suggested in terms of the language from 2022, that could make sense.
Okay.
Okay, so we have a couple of potential avenues here, and we are short on time. So just a reminder that the recommendation is currently, the unamended recommendation is in the annual report. So if we do nothing, that's sort of what'll stay. If we amended, it sounds like we could remove the study and it would then start, Darren, if I'm reading it right, with the locally operated transit systems with service profiles compatible with ZEB should develop ZEB transition plans. So it's effectively a recommendation to the local systems to develop transition plans. I don't know if there are parts of last year's recommendation that anyone would want to affirmatively add right now, or if pulling last year's recommendations forward again would satisfy that.
Can you read last year's again one more time, David?
It says the state should enact policies requiring the transition of all locally operated transit passenger buses to ZEV beginning as soon as possible with a full transition no later than 2040. What I think that one has that the amended version does not is some date parameters associated with it, which I think would be helpful if we are going to amend what we've already approved.
Okay, so we could add the 2040 date.
Mike has his hand up.
Sorry, Mike Powell.
Yeah, to me, this is a step back from what our recommendations were last year, because now we're saying that only certain certain lots would have to make the transition. And again, I mean, I'm looking at all of the recommendations. We've come down very hard on buildings. We've come down very hard on the private cars. For us to back away from a prior recommendation, because I read that as what this does, without a more fuller discussion, to me, I think it's just a mistake. If we were repeating last year's recommendation, it's one thing, but to make changes without the mitigation working group having a chance to consider this rewrite that we're proposing, I would oppose.
Okay, Darren.
Could we just strike and replace with last year's? An amendment in the form of a substitute, essentially.
I mean, I would like that for more than the amended. If
So would we still add this, the state should also offer assistance to secure grant?
I mean, you were okay with that, right, Darren? Yeah, that's a good. So if we used last year's plus the last sentence there.
Okay, so the amendment could instead strike everything leading up to this point and then add last year's recommendation. So the recommendation as a whole would effectively read as last year's recommendation plus the sentence about offering assistance.
Thank you. Go ahead, Dave.
I mean, to find compromise, I do agree with that. It's a jump back from what the MWG, as Mike just mentioned, pushed, passed and what we had approved. And I recognize the need for additional discussion, but like the 2025 to as soon as possible with this transition no later than 2040, that's a really big jump. That I'm struggling with how to approach when, again, we did approve. We had a decent amount of discussion around this recommendation last meeting, and we did move forward with it.
Tim?
Yeah, my debate is, I'm leaning towards agreeing with Mike Powell's recommendation to encourage the mitigation work group to tackle it. I just think there's a lot that would benefit from further discussion. So, as much as I hate to do that.
So Kim, then the action there would be to remove this recommendation entirely.
Yep, table it. Because the one that was originally approved is a no-go for y'all, right? Okay.
Sounds like we need to negotiate among other things about the date, which is hard to do here.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of, Mike.
Sorry for the sideline comment, but I don't think there's that much daylight between those dates. The idea of procurement requirements kicking in 2025 versus full transition of the fleet being accomplished by 2040. The lifespan of a transit bus, and correct me if I'm wrong, is typically 12 to 15 years. So
that's a good point.
To achieve a 2040 full fleet replacement means buses starting in 2025 essentially need to be electric.
Yeah, actually, that's a really good point.
But you're not technically tying the hands of requiring a 2025
The problem
date.
is that 2025 is, as I read it, all anything bought then would have to be a zero emission bus. Near-term compatibility.
Right.
And it's
I entertain a motion, what Chris had put up there, last year's language with the additional sentences we had about grants, I think is a good path forward for us rather than personally striking it entirely again. I think we'd be, as Mark just mentioned, we've kind of talked about it a bit. So I think we have what we need in that. What's up on the screen now?
Aaron, would that address MDOT's concerns? pulling last year's recommendation forward and appending the assistance for grants.
Yes, although what Mark said, I'm nervous about. 2028 be more ambitious than I realized.
2028. Thank you for that, Mark, but there,
Yes.
okay, so I think in the interest of time, I'd suggest we call a question on amending the recommendation so that it would read as these two sentences, three sentences. The state should enact policies requiring transition of all locally operated transit passenger buses to ZEV beginning as soon as possible with full transition no later than 2040. That's last year's recommendation. And then the two sentences about offering assistance for securing grants and including training and worker protections. So I suggest we entertain motions to amend the recommendation so that it would read as on the screen.
Just a comment was made. I'm not sure what full transition means. Does that mean full transition of procurement? I know Mark had suggested that he reads full transition no later than 2040 to mean you'd have to start acquiring zero emission vehicles in 2025. I don't read it that way. I read that as saying that your procurement by 2040 has to go to full ZEV, but you can delay till 2040 starting to get electric vehicles.
I was reading last year's recommendation, meaning that the whole fleet would need to fully transition to electric buses by 2040. But if that's not clear, then here's your opportunity.
Yeah, that's what I'm suggesting is if that's the intent, I think it is, then we think we should say, make that clear.
Would that make that clearer, Mike? Referring to transit passenger bus fleets transitioning to ZEV?
Yeah, I think that does, yes.
Okay, so is there a motion to amend mitigation working group recommendation number 7 to read as on the screen?
I move that we amend.
Okay, thank you, Darren. Is there a second? Okay, so we are voting now on amending recommendation 7 to read as on the screen.
Look, excuse me. Can you hear me? The audio has stopped. Mark Stewart, can you turn the mic back on, please?
Oh, sorry about that. You can hear us again?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right. I counted the yes votes online. You can all lower your hands. Thank you. I was wondering why all the hands are still there. Any
Sorry.
opposed? Any opposed to this amendment? Okay, we have one opposed to the amendment. Any abstentions? Okay, so the amendment, the recommendation is amended. It passed 17-1 with no abstentions. So that then, congratulations, concludes the consideration of recommendations this year. The final order of business then is for the commission to approve the annual report with the cleanup work left to do by the departments, which includes taking all the recommendations, putting them into the annual report, and handling formatting, etc. We included a draft of the contents of the annual report that surround the recommendations in today's materials. There's always an introduction, a message from the chair that's yet to be written. The bulk of the report is the recommendations, and then there's also always an update on the science written by the Scientific and Technical Working Group that is included. I will note one change this year is that the commission report is now required to include an analysis of state spending prepared by the department. That's a new requirement for this year. The department is working with the University of Maryland and the agencies to produce that analysis. It'll be ready next month. The commission report is due December 15th. Yes. So,
This is Robin Gilden. Two very important documents were released just this week, the 5th National Climate Change Report and the 8th Lancet Countdown Report. The climate change report has a Northeast section, and then the 8th Lancet Countdown has a US part. So is it prudent to include that information or wait to review that information before we vote? I don't know.
the update on the science was written several weeks ago by the STWG, so it would not have that reference. I think in the interest of time, I would suggest that I'm sure the STWG would be amenable to the commission attaching a string to its approval of the annual report, that the STWG should update this section to discuss any additional items from those two reports released last week. I know, Dave, if that makes you nervous, feel free to.
No, it doesn't make me nervous. I just would probably need a timeline.
Yeah, the annual report is due December 15th, so we would spend the next several weeks filling out the missing pieces and formatting it. So there would be some time for STWG to include some paragraphs on those two reports.
Thank you. I think we might also want to include the decarbonization report in that as well. That came out. I'm sorry, I don't have the exact name of the report, but yes, thank you.
Is that the National Academies one?
Academies.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah, the one that Dr. Dennison discussed last week. Okay.
Yes.
And then the question of past recommendations.
There's the remaining question of past recommendations. How we did it last year was right at the top of the recommendations section.
It's the national
We included
education.
a paragraph, and I'm just going to pull it from last year so everyone can see it. Included these two sentences. I'll just put them at the top and we'll figure out flow later. I will zoom in here. The Climate Commission continues to promote its recommendations from last year, except for this year's recommendations supersede previous recommendations. A summary of the Commission's recommendations from last year is included as an appendix to this report. So we would pull forward last year's report as an appendix. Okay, so with those lingering cleanup items, I suggest the Commission entertain a motion to approve this year's report. Pending that cleanup. So under the commission rules, we require slightly larger than a majority to approve the annual report. We require an affirmative vote of at least 16 members to approve the annual report. Is there a motion to vote on the annual report?
So moved.
And a second? Okay, so we are voting on approving the annual report with the pending cleanup items from staff. All in favor? You can lower your hands in the room. Lower your hands online. Any opposed? Or abstentions? Okay, with 19 votes in the affirmative, which is unanimous for those present, the annual report is approved, so staff will clean it up and prepare it for publication in the coming weeks. Thank you all. You're pretty much done for the year, but we do have other business on the agenda. Is there other business? We will be following up. Oh, Jennifer, yes.
Just a reminder about December 11th for the trip to Calvert Cliffs to look at the nuclear site.
So we'll be following up with an email to get head count and logistics for that from the commissioners. Okay, Madam Chair, we can adjourn.
Good job. Thank
Yay.
you. Thank you.
Great
Yay.
job.
Let's give ourselves a round of applause. Excellent, excellent. Um, we are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
No, I gotta go. I'm gonna switch this.
Don't mind.
Is that you?
No.